Welcome to another exciting episode of the Expanding Unconsciousness podcast brought to you by Monroe Institute. I'm Mark, and I will be your tour guide down the rabbit hole of the body-mind-spirit complex, which is integral to this thing that we call consciousness. My guest today is one of the foremost experts on the subject of psychoneuroimmunology, which is the topic that we will be exploring today. So, as many of you know or may have guessed by now, I'm a bit long in the tooth regarding the exploration into consciousness studies. It's been a passion of mine for decades, and truthfully, for all of my accumulated knowledge, I still consider myself very much a student. I'm personally very grateful to be part of a study which is ongoing and expanding. It's a long conversation, the conversation of consciousness, with many facets. The study of consciousness, like consciousness itself, continues to expand, and there are literally millions of rabbit holes to go down and explore if you're daring enough. In doing so, our knowledge base and understanding of consciousness expands, and through some sort of mysterious means, consciousness itself expands with it. Almost as if consciousness is like a sentient being who's waiting for our arrival to reach a new threshold of understanding. And then it says, "Oh, I see you've solved this mystery. Good. Now let's expand that threshold through creating a new mystery." And the process of expansion continues. One such mystery has been called psychic or spiritual or energetic healing. It's an age-old phenomenon which Western medical science mostly tried to debunk and discredit for the past couple of hundred years, perhaps with good reason. Throughout time, there have been a lot of charlatans in the world who have taken advantage of sick and dying people during times of great desperation in their lives. Medical science, in an attempt to get to the truth of health and healing, has always made it a point to limit their studies and applications to the scientific method. That method, of course, needed to exclude any sort of spiritually based healing methods in order to find the mechanisms behind health and well-being. Now, this method has yielded surgical procedures and medicine and a host of modern miracles which are designed to promote a long and healthy life. It's yielded a lot of good things. But a funny thing happened on the way to finding the truth of health and healing. It surfaced a few decades ago, but it's rarely discussed in the mainstream. The field of psychoneuroimmunology was born a few decades ago. In short, it's a serious clinical study and practice, or perhaps integration, of the body-mind-spirit complex. Considering these three components of the human being as a whole mechanism, a whole organism, each part of the whole affecting the whole. What was discovered by those who were daring enough to look down the rabbit hole was that such things as energetic healing, crystals, magnets, sound, etc., actually does have an observable effect on health and well-being. That meditation and the power of prayer is actually an active ingredient in not only maintaining good physical and psychological health, but can also serve to recapture health and well-being when illness occurs. In my humble opinion, the body, mind, and spirit are all components of this thing that we call consciousness. So I was very fortunate to become acquainted with psychoneuroimmunology in the 90s while acting as the recording engineer for the Monroe Institute. The Institute was invited to participate in various studies taking place at the then NIH-funded CSCAT program, which was being held at the University of Virginia. CSCAT is an acronym for the Center for the Study of Complementary and Alternative Therapies. That's a funny name, to me anyway, given that for thousands of years, faith, plant, or energetic healers were once the mainstream, ergo making modern health methods the real alternative, but there you have it. During my short but very fascinating time of being peripherally involved in this program, I was riveted by what I was hearing. The preliminary results were nothing short of astounding. Apparently, this quote-unquote placebo effect, which was poo-pooed by the academic mainstream for so long, was showing itself to be just as effective, if not in some cases more effective, than some of the other accepted therapies for any illness in question. Now, you might imagine that this new knowledge rocked quite a few clinicians. Others simply ignored the findings of this fledgling science. Call it cognitive dissonance if you want, or an unwillingness to accept new information. But for those who accepted the results, the questions then became why and how. Why did these alternative therapies actually work? How did they work? What was the mechanism? Personally speaking, I became a believer and integrated this new knowledge into my own personal health and well-being regimen. Personally speaking, it served me very well, but I'm not here to proselytize. I'm just a recording engineer and an artist, so who would listen anyway? Instead, I will let you hear it from someone whose words and authority on the subject have serious gravitas. My guest today is Dr. Shamini Jain. Dr. Jain is a scientist, a clinical psychologist, and a transformational healer who specializes in psychoneuroimmunology. Dr. Jain received her bachelor's in neuroscience and behavior from Columbia University and her PhD in clinical psychology from UC San Diego School of Medicine and UCSD, with a focus on research in that field. She has received numerous awards for her published research studies in integrative health approaches, including biofield healing and meditation. She has also written an award-winning book called Healing Ourselves, Biofield Science, and the Future of Health. Dr. Jain, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Mark. Such an honor to be here with you.
I've been looking forward to this. Psychoneuroimmunology is one of my favorite words. It's a 9-syllable word which rolls off the tongue if you practice it, 5 times a day, 20 minutes a day for about 10 years. And it's a very powerful word, which I think many people are not familiar with. So let's start off the interview with having you explain exactly what psychoneuroimmunology is and what it implies.
Well, Mark, first of all, you should get an honorary degree in psychoneuroimmunology for being able to say it so well and so many times. We actually joke, none of us like to say that word, so we often say PNI for
Really?
short.
Really?
Yeah.
I love
But the word sure sounds highfalutin, right? It sounds
does.
very important. And let's break it down. Psyche. Psyche really means spirit.
Right.
That's truly what it means. Often in the sciences here in the West, we sort of conflate it or shift it to really focus more on what we think of as psychology, cognitive function, brain function, maybe emotions, maybe mind. That's often how the connotation of psyche shows up in traditional Western, empirical culture.
Mm-hmm.
But psyche actually means spirit. Neuro, central nervous system,
Right.
brain, spinal cord, and immuno, right? Immunology, the immune system. There's a companion field, of course, called psychoneuroendocrinology. And for those who like the really long, fancy words, we have psychoneuroimmunoendocrinology,
Ouch.
right? So ENIE or something like that. So what does all of it mean? And why do we even use these terms? Well, because only 60 years ago, if we would even mention a term like that, we would have been laughed at in
Right.
science and medicine, because I like to remind people that 60 years ago, we didn't even believe that the brain and the immune system talk to each other. And it was because of the work of founding fathers and mothers like Candace Pert and Bob Ader and others that we began to discover that, actually the brain and the immune system talk to each other. So they also talk to the hormonal system. And this became, to be a basis for our understanding of things like what we call in the West mind-body medicine, or really mind-body-spirit medicine.
Right.
So bringing the psyche back into, because it's not just neuroimmunology, right? And it's not just neuroendocrinology.
Right.
Although I will tell you candidly that I have been in discussions as a postdoc at UCLA listening to junior faculty say, can't we just take the psyche out of psychoneuroimmunology? Because I'm having a hard time getting these, findings out to my peers in neuroscience. And, they think the psyche is fluffy.
Right.
Well, that's really interesting, especially for our audiences here, in this podcast, because we're all aware of the power of the psyche.
Right.
I have to say, when I heard that as a postdoc, I was in shock. Here I am at UCLA and people are wanting to take the psyche out of psychoneuroimmunology. And I'm like, wow, you're really missing the point. Because for me, unpacking that word and what we've been discovering in the areas of biofield science, exploring the fields of energy and information that guide our health, the psyche is a powerful part of psychoneuroimmunology. And how has that been showing up in our research? It's showing up, for example, initially in exploring the realm of emotion and its relationship with health and health outcomes, right? And now well-being and its relationship. And as we've noticed over the past decades, we're moving from just looking at things like negative emotion, like depression and hostility, on cardiovascular disease, which was the early work that we often did in psychoneuroimmunology. Now we're looking at things like gratitude and non-dual awareness,
right,
and their very real effects on physiology. So we're looking all the way from the spiritual to the physical. And I think that's what excites me so much about the field of psychoneuroimmunology is we can hold the potential for that, right? To explore these different facets of our experience and connect them in this way.
If the scientific community is welcome or happy to go down that rabbit hole, because it does bring up a lot of issues with people who are more mechanistic in their thinking. I'm very aware of the randomized trials that you've done on meditation, hands-on healing, the other modalities that you use in there. You've done some incredible studies, which if the audience is interested in reading, it can all be found on your website, and I highly recommend you do if you're listening. One study in particular caught my attention. It was the metadata of the studies that you did at Harvard and MD Anderson with cancer patients. Would you mind speaking about that metadata and the conclusions that you can draw from these modalities and the effects on cancer patients?
Yes, I'd love to. It's some of the most exciting work, I think, that is helping us explore how, what we call energy is getting under the skin. And just to be clear, it's not really a meta-analysis that I did here, but I've summarized a lot of the most cutting-edge recent work in the field in my book, Healing Ourselves. Right. So this data that we're talking about can be found in the chapter on energy under the skin. And also we talk about it a little bit under what's the mechanism, which maybe you and I will get to today when we explore how is this happening. But essentially, here's what we know so far. And this is from the most recent peer-reviewed, published research by tenured professors at major universities. There have been 3 labs at this point, for example, that have reported on effects with energy healing in cell culture models with cancer and healthy cells. So let's just take that data to begin with. These studies were done at Harvard, at University of Connecticut, and MD Anderson Cancer Center. So what were they finding? Well, this is first of all some of the most fascinating work here, where they found that, and these were different energy healers. One was external Qigong at Harvard. The other was a therapeutic touch compared to mock therapeutic touch at University of Connecticut. And then the other one was actually looking specifically at Sean Harabantz. If some of your listeners may be familiar with Sean, as he did a lot of work with ions back in the day on psychic abilities too. So they were looking at his healing ability, and they're extending that now with other healers. So what they did was they actually had healers of different sorts direct energy at these cells in a petri dish. And they were randomized so that sometimes they were directing energy at cells which were healthy, and other times the cells were cancerous. And in each of these sites, what they found was when the healer was directing energy at healthy cells, they would proliferate or grow in number. But when they would direct energy at the cancer cells, they would decrease in number. And so this was really curious. As I was sifting through the data, I thought, wow, this is really curious. And then when you dive down deeper, you start realizing that they're also looking at very specific aspects of the signaling pathway. So I'll just summarize again, because we can get really deep with data, but I don't want to bore anyone, and it's kind of hard when you're just hearing it. I encourage people to read the papers or read about my descriptions where I get into more detail in the book on this. But at this point, beyond just that data, there have been data now with animal models of cancer, and we'll just focus on Gloria Granowicz's work at University of Connecticut with mouse models of cancer, and Lorenzo Cohen and team's work at MD Anderson Cancer Center with mouse models of cancer. Again, different healers, sham-controlled or placebo, supposedly what we call placebo-controlled conditions. And they have found in these carefully controlled studies that energy healing, again, these animals aren't being touched, energy is being directed to them in the same room, but they're not being handled by the healer. Energy healing is showing an effect with tumor spread, particularly. In one study, tumor size was also shown to be reduced, but in the studies at University of Connecticut and at MD Anderson Cancer Center, tumor spread was affected so that metastasis was actually decreased, and they looked really fine-grained. Gloria began looking at the inflammatory cytokines. Those are inflammation, kind of driving transmitters, immune transmitters, if you will, like we think of neurotransmitters. These are immune transmitters. She found reductions in these inflammatory cytokines that were related to metastasis or tumor growth. Now, of course, Lorenzo was aware of Gloria's work, so he replicated that, looking at the same immune transmitters, saw the same reduction. But then Lorenzo, as Gloria did too, took it a step further, looking at cell subsets. And Lorenzo's work now is really just looking all the way down to cell signaling mechanisms, including protein kinase levels, and now actually looking at fluctuations in ion gradients across cell membranes to really get down to the level of granularity that, honestly, some of our reductionist researchers and funders want to see. Which is, how could this be happening? Okay, we're seeing these effects of energy healing compared to sham healing in carefully controlled conditions reduce the spread of cancer in mouse models of cancer. How could this possibly be happening?
It's got to perk up some ears, right? It's got to perk up some ears. I'm very curious to know about your measuring in the energy field that's just below the skin. Are we measuring skin potential voltage?
There are explorations on how do we best measure this. This is a separate project that, some people are looking at. There is a project going on right now based in the Netherlands with many of our colleagues kind of consulting on the project, kind of coming together to explore how can we measure the biofield, really? How can we measure it? What are the most tried and true ways? So they're taking a very grounded, conservative approach, looking at things that we know about, like skin conductance, like magnetoencephalograms and magnetic potential slightly off of the body, biophoton emission. And they're just beginning to try to put the pieces of that data together, looking at it in the context of emotional states, healer-healy interactions. So I think we'll begin to see a little bit more of the first steps of that grounded research on biofield fluctuations, during these healing, these healing encounters, and also with respect to emotion, because healers, and anyone will tell you, right? The biofield is here. It's always fluctuating. It completely relates to our state of mind, our state of consciousness, our state of emotions. So that's sort of a separate area. Where Lorenzo is starting to take the work is just begin to do sort of what one would typically do in drug research, which is to see if we can block the effect, using gene knockouts and maybe blocking EMFs. And it's been a really curious conversation. I actually had the good fortune to interview Lorenzo and Mike Levin, whose work is just phenomenally outstanding. He's doing more biofield related work in regenerative medicine at Tufts University. And as Lorenzo was sharing, this is what we're going to do next. We're going to try to block the effect. We're going to do this. We're going to create gene knockout mice to see if we can knock out the pathway and see if we see the effects. And I sat and took a breath for a moment. And then I said, Lorenzo, we know that things in the body are pleiotropic, meaning that they have multiple effects. Even one cytokine can affect many different pathways in the body. Do you really think that if we block one pathway in the body, that, given what we're learning, that this is not just energy, but it's information. We're seeing that because energy is driving cell proliferation differently, whether it's healthy cells or cancer cells. There's information being transmitted, right? Do you really think if we block one pathway, it's possible that the effects might just not occur in a different pathway? And he paused for a moment and said, I guess that's possible. And I said, well, I hope you're going to look at that, because I'd be surprised if the effect completely went away. So we'll see, right? It's a discovery.
It is a discovery. And I'm so pleased that you're running up against a resistance from more mechanistic scientists, because I think that's how the conversation unfolds and we find the truth. It's wonderful to have that little bit of resistance. And naysaying and, absolute poo-pooing is not going to get us anywhere. But I'm very curious to talk about the mechanisms as you understand them right now behind what is occurring here. Unlike so many clinical trials and studies regarding drugs with active ingredients, quote unquote, which are designed to stave off and cure illness, psychoneuroimmunology is obviously drugless and requires no FDA approval, yet we know that it works. So from your perspective as a scientist, have you any idea why this truly is occurring? It's amazing to me that it is occurring. I have personal experience with it. I know it works. I keep myself well as a result of my meditation practice, and I'm mindful about what I say and what I feel. But as a psychologist, you know that there are certain aspects of this that have to do with the thinking, feeling complex and our own beliefs about what is possible. And that's going to take us, that's a wholly separate dynamic in the training process that I'd like to get a little more deeply into. From your perspective so far, let's stick with that question. Why is this occurring? How is this occurring?
I just gave a talk for my colleagues at the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine, which was on what I call the smart and heart approach to science and medicine. And this really is about perspective and the way that we even approach a question. And so with respect to mechanism, I will be honest, I don't like the word. It implies a singularity. It implies that there is a one way, a one path. And as we just talked about, what we've learned from the body is we're a whole system. Things have multiple effects on the body. So the idea that there is only one singular mechanism that explains these effects of biofield healing is, I think, problematic. That's step one. So what does that mean? So in other words, often in science, we're told that we have to use something called Occam's razor, right? Use the most parsimonious explanation to explain an effect. And there's truth and value to that approach, no doubt. You don't want to overcomplicate things. You don't want to throw out natural law for no reason, right? You don't want to do that. And yet when we apply Occam's razor in this way, we're forced to sort of keep thinking binarily, like in this way of like it's an either or, it's got to be this or that. Either it's placebo or it's EMFs or it's non-local.
Right.
And so what I talk about in my book, Healing Ourselves, in the What's the Mechanism chapter, where I really get into detail on why I say this, Mark, and what the data is supporting it is, it's more than even a both and, it's a whole system. We are seeing effects on multiple levels. So when we explore placebo explanations, or what we call placebo, we see that, for example, what we call placebo, are really fundamental healing elements that have to do with expectation, subconscious conditioning, ritual, relationship, meaning and context. That shows up in every aspect of care and medicine, whether we're talking about drugs, surgery, or integrative health approaches, acupuncture, energy healing. So yeah, placebo, as we call it, could explain some of the effects, but as we get into the nuance of it, we've seen, for example, even in my own randomized placebo-controlled trials, that placebo doesn't account for everything.
Right.
Okay, what about electromagnetic fields? A lot of people are interested in that. Like, for example, Lorenzo's going to try to block EMFs. Could EMFs be the answer? We don't really know. We haven't done a lot of research yet comparing, for example, some of the systematic things that have been done with EMF machines on voltage gradient shifts in cell membranes. We haven't really been doing those studies with healers, and we've never, to my knowledge, done a study that is published where we've compared devices with healers to look and see if they both affect voltage gradients in the same way, done the blocking effects. So EMFs could explain some of it, but they certainly don't explain non-local healing. And we know from the data that non-local healing happens, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So let's just take a step back and think about this for a moment. If we then said that everything can be explained by non-local means, meaning through entanglement, we now know that entanglement actually affects macroscopic systems. We see entanglement-like behavior in biology, including in the homing behavior of birds. We see entanglement behavior in fish. Vision, like there's so many models now looking at this more from an entanglement perspective.
Right.
Even if that is true, and there's many questions about how non-local healing works and how that could potentially affect physiology. Our bodies are built as whole systems, and we have redundancies, if you will, right? So we have to start thinking about multiple mechanisms and multiple pathways, taking more of a systems biology type of perspective to this work, where we say, it could be about all of it. It could be my relationship and my belief system could open the field, for example, for possibility for healing to occur more broadly on the non-local level, right? These things interact. So most scientists don't like this. It's very complex.
Yes.
It's very difficult to model. But if we're really interested in the phenomena, then we're going to have to go there. We can't just keep hanging our hat on one potential explanation and think that we can rule all the others out, because the data doesn't really support that. The data supports all of them playing a role. So if you were to ask me personally, I think there's room for non-locality. There's potentially room for understanding the role of EMFs, and there's room for what we call placebo in helping describe why these effects are so powerful. And I just want to underscore for those who aren't familiar with the work, we are talking about powerful effects on humans as well as animals. Our systematic reviews are showing that these types of biofield healing approaches, and these are very detailed systematic reviews where we're combining data across all of the studies, powerful effects on reducing pain, reducing anxiety, behavioral symptoms of dementia, symptoms in cancer, and effects on physiology in people, not just animals. So these are very powerful and real effects that we're seeing.
Most certainly. And if you don't believe it, read the data. And you can do that while we take a short break. We'll be back in just a minute with Dr. Shamini Jain.
Expanding on Consciousness is brought to you by the Monroe Institute, a nonprofit organization and leader in consciousness education and research, teaching you how to actively explore and use expanded states of consciousness, providing direct experiences that are deeply personal, uniquely meaningful, and life-changing. Monroe has been helping people create more meaningful and joyful lives through the guided exploration of expanded consciousness for 50 years. Gain the knowledge and understanding you seek to create the life you desire. Learn more about where to start your journey to expanded awareness with Monroe. Visit monroeinstitute.org or check out our Expand Meditation app, available on the App Store or Google Play.
Is it possible that we can employ Occam's razor here and make the mechanism simply consciousness as the key word behind health and healing?
Yes, it's a beautiful reframe. It's a beautiful reframe. Now, most would say that's not parsimonious at all, because we have no idea what consciousness is. Good. Yes, now we've reduced it down to one word, but we have no idea what that means, right? Yes. As you know, scientific society is devoted to the study of consciousness, and lots of mental machinations on the nature and role of consciousness here. But yes, if we boil it down to consciousness, then we can explore it from the local and non-local perspective, from the interactive perspective, interactive consciousness. It truly does make great sense. But how do we operationalize that in empirical research? It's one of the key questions. But there are ways that we're doing that.
We have to first define what that means, right?
Define what it means, operationalize it. Yeah, it's a great question. And as a person who grew up and still is very anchored in Jain spiritual heritage, one of our main tenets is something that we call anekantavad, which means non-absolutism, or truth from multiple perspectives.
Right.
And I like to apply that to consciousness, because if I go to you and say, Mark, I know what consciousness is. It's this. I've just alienated you if you don't think the way I do. right?
Or you've broadened my perspective because I don't know what it is. I've been
Right.
studying it for decades. So,
Yes.
I freely admit that there are many perspectives on it, and that I want to get to the truth of it. And maybe the truth of the word consciousness is it is all inclusive. Continue with
Yes.
absolutism.
Yes, and in some ways we were exploring the biofield in the same way. So in my book I talk about consciousness with the big C versus consciousness with the little c.
Right.
It kind of relates to Chalmers's discussions on the hard problem of consciousness, and as you might know, in his most recent, he's evolved quite a bit, as you might know, in his views on consciousness over the years, and now he sort of describes big C consciousness as potentially just universal law. It just is. Right. It was a little different from how he viewed consciousness or the way he described it in his earlier years. But we can talk about little c consciousness as those things like conscious awareness, sensory integration, the things that, we can kind of connect with brain function more clearly, create computational models on. But then when we talk about the phenomenological experience of consciousness, the nature of qualia, then we start getting into more of that big C consciousness realm, where this is more difficult for us to operationalize, compare with each other. And when we look at the ancient traditions and their understandings and descriptions of what I would call big C consciousness, this all-encompassing aspect that you mentioned, right? The fabric of the all, the oneness, right, or the void. So many ways that we've described it. The nothingness or the everythingness from which form occurs. And how does that happen? Let's just go with these ancient perspectives for a minute. So let's just go with the ancient perspective. This is just the one I'm more familiar with, right? From the sort of the Vedic tantric approaches, the description of oneness consciousness, big C consciousness as a formless oneness, sometimes described as the Shiva principle or Shiva, right? Wasn't really just a personified God. That came later, in the culture. They personified everything to help grok what we were trying to talk about. Right. But it's oneness. It has no form. It's limitless. There is no even desire for form. But then what happens? Shakti, which could be described as the manifest power behind the universe, brings consciousness into form. This is the interplay of Shakti and Shiva. And I sometimes, in my own personal view, I wouldn't say that all scientists agree with me on this at all, but I would liken Shakti as the big B biofield. Okay, so this is the energy, if you will, that brings consciousness into form, the aliveness that is in everything around us in this universe, which we often view as material. And so it is that thread of life energy that we connect to in our meditation, in our spiritual practice, in energy healing, right? And just like consciousness, we can boil the big B biofield down to little b biofields, and we can start studying the little b biofield of a cell and look at cell membranes, or we can look at the little b biofield of a person and start measuring the biophoton emission, right? We can look at the interactive biofield of us and the earth or between each other. So it's just so much fun, and it's so fascinating to explore all of these dimensions of consciousness, dimensions of the biofield that we can understand. Ultimately, for me, it's about bringing us back to the heart of it, which is bringing us back to the nature of who we truly are as human beings on this planet, what we might be able to do with that understanding, that knowing, not even a knowledge, but a knowing, to help mitigate the suffering that we see in the world today. Really, for me personally, that's the point of it.
Yes, I heard you speak about that with Dr. Chopra, and I thought to myself that needs to be part of this conversation, but you're already bringing it in. I know that your interest in the biofield is very strong right now. So we know that there's a relationship between consciousness and energy. I'm just trying to break it down for the scientists who might be having a real problem with this, because, consciousness is something that scientists study. Energy is something that scientists study. Perhaps they're related in some strange way that the mystics knew about, that we need to reintroduce our ourselves to.
I'll tell you a funny story about that, Mark. When we started my nonprofit, the Consciousness and Healing Initiative,
Right.
and we were a group of biofield scientists, we initially began the initiative to support the researchers that were doing research in healing, in biofield healing in particular, the energy healing and subtle energy healing world. When I got downloaded basically the name for our collaborative and went to my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Richard Hammerschlag, who has been with us at the Consciousness and Healing Initiative since its inception and serves as our research director, he said, wait, Shamini, consciousness. He said, wait a minute, we can't do that. We're already talking about the biofield. That's one unknown. Now you want to bring consciousness into the picture? We're dealing with two unknowns. This is not good for research. And I said, Richard, you've just got to trust me on this. It has everything to do with consciousness. I promise you. Then he began to read the work of Erwin Laszlo. Mm-hmm. And he said, oh, okay, I get this now.
Right.
I'm beginning to understand this relationship between consciousness and the biofield. It's very real.
It is very real. And it takes it out of the realm of the mystic and into the realm of the scientist, which will give it somewhat more credibility and put it to the test, because my experience of consciousness is, if I can distill it down to anything, is it's expanding. It's going to continue to expand. Expanding into what? I cannot answer, obviously. But it is teaching us, as we expand it, as we create this paradigm shift through conversation and trying to understand, that there's more to the picture than meets the eye. You referred to consciousness from a very personal level before, and in a very impersonal level. You called it natural law versus, let's call it, the psychology of an individual. There is an interaction that is going on, but I'm getting into conjecture here between, if we're talking about the soul of humanity versus the ego of humanity, and that it's subject-object split and how we move, trying to reconcile all of that.
Right.
There is something that is occurring in this biofield that you seem to be very interested in, and I think that's a beautiful term for it because it's applicable, or it's apropos. And there's an interaction that seems to be occurring between the individual healer and the individual healee. And that interaction, that space between the two, is a unifying force that is touching upon one another. And again, I like to boil things down easily with the words. Let's call it a relationship.
Yeah.
A relationship that seems to have some sort of ability to vibrationally resonate one to another and make a transition from one state into another state, much like a protein can translate from one state into another state. No real reason why. Nobody knows why. What are you teaching of Chi to help people to affect healing and health?
Thank you for asking. So much of our work at the Consciousness and Healing Initiative has been to bring first and foremost to people awareness of the evidence. And so a lot of our work historically has been that. And what happened, Mark, is as we began to do that, we noticed that there's so many healing practitioners who were so excited about learning about the evidence base, because it helped them also stand in their power and their truth as healers and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. And I get this all the time, Mark. I had a woman come up to me in my last event in London, in person, and come up to me in tears and said, thank you, because you're helping me stand in my power and my authority as a healer to say there's really evidence behind what I'm doing. And here it is. Yeah. So a lot of work that we do is empowering healers and all in healthcare in this way. We've just completed a really beautiful Science of Healing course, which, in true Chi fashion, we call ourselves a collaborative accelerator to forward the science and practice of healing. And what does that mean? We bring together multiple facets of wisdom. So yes, we bring the science and the scientists, but we also bring healing practitioners, spiritual practitioners, educators, and artists to lead humanity to heal ourselves. So we offer, free webinars every month to allow people to just kind of come in, join live. People join all over the world to connect with leading healing teachers and scientists to learn in community. And we've just kind of put together this beautiful offering, which is still available, called the Science of Healing course, with 35 stellar guest faculty. And these are, some of our favorite people that we know very well, beautiful teachers in the space like Deepak Chopra and Greg Braden, Bruce Lipton, Cindy Dale, Donna Eden, many others. And also maybe researchers that everyone hasn't heard from yet, that are just on the ground, conducting stellar research in the area of mind, body, spirit practices, meditation, qigong, energy healing, just really learning about the latest and the greatest data. So we've been focusing a lot of those efforts within the Consciousness and Healing Initiative on sharing both the science and the practice. We often have healing circles where we bring together our healing practitioners and we hold space for each other and discuss different aspects of healing as they relate to the divine feminine, to human earth connection, things like that. So it's a real joy. I love all the educational work that we do. Our current research is really focused on delivering these healing practices to underserved communities. So during COVID, we did a project looking at distant sound healing. So this was a virtually delivered sound healing approach using an approach called Biofield tuning, which was developed by healing practitioner and scientist, as she likes to be known, Eileen McCusick. And in an upshot, what we found, and this is when we delivered these distant sound healing to people who met criteria for generalized anxiety disorder during the shutdown of the pandemic. So they really weren't able to access care. Profound decreases in anxiety. So we're following this up now with a randomized controlled trial, but now we're really targeting those in underserved communities, particularly those financially underserved, those in LGBTQ, SIA2+ communities and BIPOC communities who are often facing a disparity in care for mental health. So we're planning to deliver these practices to them in community, comparing them with sort of whatever is the state of the art in those community settings to see if it's helpful. And the ultimate goal for that program of research is, if it is helpful, and we suspect it will be, we're going to train people on how to do it. Because a lot of these biofield approaches, you don't need a PhD to do. You don't need an MD to do. You don't even need a master's in social work. You do need training. But this is a way that we can rapidly deploy some of the best of care, spiritually based, energetic care to communities who need it the most. So, I have discussions sometimes with our scientists who are like, well, you're not controlling for XYZ. And I explain to them, this is more of what we would call a comparative effectiveness trial. We're really sort of moving forward with, does this work in the community? Is it helpful? And if so, can we scale it? So I'm really excited about broadening the base of research in that area, because I just simply cannot sit with seeing the unmitigated and easily, in my view, addressable suffering that we're seeing in this planet. And mental health is a great place to focus. So we're going to be focusing quite a bit on mental emotional health at the initiative.
Well, that's compassion in action. And compassion is obviously a part of Buddhism and Jainism and Hinduism. I'm thinking about the Sanskrit words karuna and maitri. They denote a deeply felt sympathy that is part of a resonance with someone else's suffering. And I ask this question because I've studied a few forms of energetic healing, Reiki being one, a couple of others that were more palliative. And then I studied a integrative Kabbalistic healing technique, which was more psycho-spiritual in nature. So we're using a balancing of the energy centers that are known as the Sefirot within Kabbalah. They're polarized, so that addresses the dualistic nature of reality or consciousness, and balanced as a positive and negative male-female type of force, and neutralized in the center pillar, just to give you a quick rundown. But the root of that healing mechanism is really about compassion. From the Latin compati, to suffer with. In other words, to know your own suffering is the true ability to be able to resonate with another's suffering. And when the two meet in that flavor or that energy of compassion, healing occurs. So now we're talking about a psychological issue and an energetic issue, both of which I don't see as an either or. This is a psycho-spiritual
They are very
doubt.
linked. Yes,
Right.
absolutely linked. Yeah.
So when somebody is performing a, let's say, Reiki session on somebody who's got a presenting complaint, as I said before, I consider that to be more palliative and an orientation towards faith. In other words, the universal healing energy or the healing energy of the cosmos, or whatever your conception of the divine is going to move through you if you're a clear enough vessel and into that other person to fix the problem. But as we all know, that doesn't always work. Or if it works, sometimes it works temporarily. Because the consciousness of the individual who's receiving it is stuck in a certain set point, which is usually informed by childhood trauma, let's say, is, generally, and colors their worldview or their perception of self and other. And that creates a large split in the psyche, and let alone the connection that we have to soul, or the individual soul, or a connection of the individual soul to the collective soul. I mean, there are lots of ways to talk about that. Mm-hmm. So you're a psychologist, you're a clinical researcher, you understand psychoneuroimmunology, and you have a background in compassion through your upbringing and your spiritual practice. I'm wondering if you've done any clinical work regarding the studies around compassion and the healing effects of compassion, being that type of
I would love to. And I don't think that in general in the biofield work, it's, as you know, more studied in meditation and sort of the experience of compassion in the meditator. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be absolutely phenomenal if we did more qualitative studies with healing practitioners on the nature of their compassion, and potentially look at, what those effects of compassion could be, looking at the different. Now, there's been a little bit of work that I and others have done, and just sort of looking at relationship and connection, not necessarily compassion, but how connected people felt with each other. For example, the healer and healee. So there are a few studies out there, kind of exploring the nature of emotional connection. But the experience of compassion in and of itself for a healer is so ripe for investigation, right? And how that compassion, as you alluded to in the earlier part of what you were saying, how that is received. I will just mention, because I am a data nerd, I have to mention this one study that was done by Dr. Kathy Kemper, right, when she was at the university at Ohio State University. And there she actually did look at that transpersonal connection between the healer and healee, working with a meditator who was very well versed in loving kindness practice meditation. Mm-hmm. So it was that particular type of practice, which we would really expand to say is, in my view, is a biofield healing practice, because here it's very transpersonal. Right. But this was the practice. It was loving kindness. And just in a nutshell, what she found was they were in the same room. They had 4 different types of conditions. One where they were just sort of sitting next to each other, resting and reading together. Mm-hmm. Another where the receiver was reading and the loving kindness practitioner would put their hand on their shoulder and kind of direct compassionate energy. Mm-hmm. Another where they were just sitting together and the receiver is thinking that the meditator is just reading, but the meditator is actually sending compassion to the receiver, but the receiver doesn't know it. Right. And then one of just a solid baseline. What Kathy found was that whether the receiver knew or not that they were getting radiated with compassion, the receiver's heart rate variability would shift in a way that the vagus nerve was more activated. There was increased overall heart rate variability in both cases, whether they were being touched and knew that compassion was being sent, or whether they had no idea and they were reading, right? So I've talked with Kathy about, we should replicate this and we should, kind of explore this more. There's so much wonderful work that we can do in this field to really answer those kinds of beautiful questions.
Well, I'm interested in the science of compassion. I'm interested in the science of healing. I love science, but science applied, or compassion applied, is far more powerful.
Yes, and I think this is exactly where the Dalai Lama is, as I understand it, as he's been talking with the researchers. I think everyone is feeling the need to apply our findings at this point. You just can't separate it out. And that's not to say that science isn't beautiful for science sake. It is. I know many scientists, I've had researchers tell me, I don't really care if my findings are ever applied. I'm in it for the discovery. And that's, no judgment. That's a beautiful thing. But when we're talking about things like compassion, how do we see compassion in action? What kind of effects would it have? And it takes me all the way back to those initial studies that were done with the TM groups, the TM Siddhi practitioners and meditators, and effects on social outcomes. We would love to see more of that work replicated across different types of traditions and explored. And I think it's all possible to do.
Well, in your interview with Dr. Chopra, you had, and I'm quoting you here, you described energetic healing as one to draw another closer to their own soul nature. Mm-hmm. To me, that speaks of the relationship of sympathetic resonance. You have to know your own soul and your connection to that soul nature in order to impart that, whether verbally, non-verbally, energetically, to another person. And that lifts them into a new state of being, which I believe probably affects the biofield, but I don't sit around measuring the biofield. I wouldn't even know how to approach that right now.
Most of us don't. Most of us don't know how yet, but we have a felt sense of it, right? Yes. I have a felt sense of it just in this conversation with you.
Yes.
It is. So I always remind everyone, while we're looking for the instrumentation, be your own scientist. Go back to observation. Observe the subtle sensations in your body and your field, and be your own explorer. How does your state of consciousness affect your awareness of the energy inside and around you? And how does that show up?
Yes, and that too is compassion in action. So aside from psychology, what do you recommend as a means of exploring consciousness and its relationship to energy and healing, if any, in your work with Chi?
Well, first of all, the data is very clear. There are so many practices. When we look at the empirical data for so many different contemplative practices, whether they're meditation, prayer, being in nature in reverence, sound, devotional sound making, there are so many, devotional movement. There are so many ways to access those deeper realms of consciousness and the experience of the biofield along with it. And so I really encourage people to do what calls you, what you're excited about, either something that's rooted in the tradition that you're in, or exploring something new and seeing what that's like. Because honestly, the data supports all of them. When we look at the physiological data, the mental health data, right? They're more similar than different. And we see that in psychotherapy approaches too. We call it the dodo bird effect. Mm-hmm. It's the Alice in Wonderland dodo bird, for those who are familiar. Everybody gets a prize because truly all of these practices are more similar than different. Why? Because they're just bringing us back to our own soul nature. That's really the case. For me personally, in my own teaching, separate in a way from Chi, my own personal work and my own personal teaching that I do with my dear colleagues, and Bruce Lipton, for example, we've been doing a lot of programs together. We're going to be doing more again this year, but also separately. I am a big believer in sound making, coming from a singing background and loving to sing since I have been a child. Noticing how shut down most people are with their voice. I think that working with your inner sound making, whether it's just creatively playing, whether it's singing your favorite songs, whether it's just sighing when you need to let out some energy, whether it's singing devotionally, whether it's doing mantra work, all of it can be very powerful for resonating with those aspects of yourself that either emotional energy perhaps that you need to clear, or even deeper, to connecting with aspects of divinity that in truth aren't really separate from you. I mean, that's your decision, your relationship with the divine. Everyone has their own relationship with the divine and how we parse that and experience it. But sound is a vehicle, is a really powerful vehicle for me personally. And I found in my teaching with others, it's a really powerful vehicle that I've seen for pretty much everyone that I've been working with.
Well, you're not going to get an argument from me. We started off this conversation with our mutual love for sound and healing and music, and I would love to have you back to discuss exactly those topics in the future. I know you have a hard stop tonight, but for those who want to find more out about you and psychoneuroimmunology and the research that you've done, tell the listeners where they can find out more about the work that you're doing.
You bet. So if you're interested in some of the data and also some of the practices, please go to healingourselvesbook.com. The reason I want you to go to healingourselvesbook.com, you can get my book on Amazon and everywhere, and please do. But when you go to healingourselvesbook.com, you'll also get access to many different bonuses, including free meditations, dialogues with Deepak and Greg and Bruce and all of that. So it's a wonderful resource. And that takes you to my website. You can kind of tool around there and have fun. And please go visit us at the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, or CHI. And that website is really easy to remember. It's chi.is or chi.is. So instead of chi.com, you're going to chi.is, and you'll find a treasure trove of really wonderful things, resources for you there, webinars, free reports, the Science of Healing course. I mean, there's just so much that our nonprofit is offering, and I'm so honored to be continuing to, help shepherd the initiative and all the great work that the initiative is doing.
And it also makes a profound statement. She is.
Exactly.
It really does. I know light when I see it. I'm looking at it right now. Thank you for being the light. Thank you so much for your time today and for your diligent work in this fascinating field. I wish you the best of success in helping humanity to help heal itself. I believe that you are going to do great things, and I look forward to another very long conversation about sound, vibration, healing, and its effect on the biofield.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Thank you. It's really been a pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
The pleasure was mine. Thank you for being here. Well, there you have it. The reason I love the word psychoneuroimmunology, it's consciousness applied. It's a space where magic and medicine meet. It's a space where science and spirituality meet. It's a space where old paradigms can shift and new learning about ourselves as humans, the whole human, can integrate. If we continue to expand our knowledge base about what consciousness is and what energy is, and explore the relationship between the two, I believe we as a race and individually will do amazing things, but it's going to require that we each do our part in some measure. The exploration of consciousness can be achieved simply by doing what we humans do naturally, and that is to ask questions and seek answers. Personally exploring and giving a curious ear to others is also a strong component. To listen with compassion and understanding. In this way, the world can be healed. So, how does one explore consciousness? As Dr. Jan so clearly said, there are so many methods, such as the ones taught at the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, or the Monroe Institute, or the Institute of Noetic Sciences, or even within the sphere that you're currently familiar with. It's any space where the psyche is acknowledged as being a part of you, even if that space is within your own mind. And the effects of doing so are so profound and far-reaching. If the exploration of consciousness has one link among the many paths available to explore it, I think it would be this. If you take the time to learn, you can explore and understand consciousness through meditation. My old friend Bob Monroe suggested this in an affirmation he offered, which begins with the phrase, "I am more than my physical body," the psyche or soul. And Bob went on to say that in doing so, one could learn to direct, control, and use this energy system, which is consciousness, in a new way. And that's a game changer. Okay, I'm proselytizing now. Guilty as charged, but I hope it at least inspires your curiosity. I want to thank all of you for listening, and I hope that you will use this information to create wisely. See you next time.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2022, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.